I'm sure you've had these moments in your life, like I have, where one moment that you didn't know was important, you look back on 20, 30 years later and you realize that it's kind of changed the course of what you've chosen to do with your life or the person that you seek to be. And looking back on one of those moments in my life, it stands out to me that it wasn't because I did the right thing that I'm now who I was. It was because I failed to. One of those moments from me is from back in high school, and it comes from a friendship that I had from the theater. I've been involved in some way on stage since I was about 10, and found a way to do it now. But that put me in proximity with and relationship with a lot of different kinds of people. The theater community for a lot is a safe haven for people that feel like they aren't necessarily welcomed or that they don't necessarily belong in another place, and you come and get to act out the stories of other people's lives sometimes. And so that meant that as a young, straight, white, able-bodied, well-educated, middle-class, go on kid, I got to be put in relationship with people that I might not be in relationship with otherwise. And some of those were the first gay and lesbian people I'd ever known as friends. I grew up in a house where I never heard a disparaging thing said about a GLBT person or person of another race, but we also weren't a family that marched in the Pride Parade either. And so I thought I was doing a pretty good job. And I can remember a friendship that I had with the first openly out man that I knew in my high school. And in private, we hung out a lot. We had separate groups of friends, but we were in that theater group. We had conversations about his life, what it meant to fall in love, the risks that he was taking. And my guess is that through our private conversations, he probably imagined I was a pretty good ally. But I remember a moment where he might have thought otherwise. I was probably 16 or 17, standing at the end of a really long hallway in my high school, a kind of institutional long hallway of lockers and barren walls and stuff. And I could tell from the other end of the hallway that something wasn't right. Like I said, he was the only out kid in the entire school of about 3,000 kids. And I saw two kind of big, burly, bully kind of guys, and he was back up against the wall. And I couldn't hear them. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. For whatever reason, whatever rationalization I gave to myself, that was a moment when I found another place to be. I have thought about that moral failure many times in my adult life. I don't know if he even knew it happened. Did he see me? This certainly isn't my story, it's his. But I wondered. He never brought it up later in any of our private conversations. I always wondered if he had been witness to that moment where somebody who should have done something, who in private would say that they would, in public, when the stakes were a little higher, did nothing. I've carried that moment with me, and it has informed my feeling about what it means to either stand by as a witness to injustice in the world, stand on the sidelines, and believe that someone else will take care of these things for me, for us. It was a moment where, and perhaps this is just an adolescent thing, I was more concerned with my sense of belonging and welcoming than somebody else's. I was much more guest than host in that moment. I think that on the whole, religion in general bears kind of that reputation. A study came out a few years ago where Christian churches had asked unchurched people what their first reaction was to Christian people and Christian institutions. Now, I know that that's not necessarily us, but it's telling. The top 3 answers that unchurched people gave were a lot like what our friend Gail thought before she walked into a church. And they are judgmental, anti-gay, and hypocritical. That's a tough PR list to overcome. I mean, the reality is that it's not just a PR problem. Religion in general has played all of the roles in that little hallway story. Some congregations, some people, some faith traditions are out there working visibly, passionately, so that things like that don't happen. They're saying, no, this will not stand. We're going to go march in the parade today. Some traditions, some people, some congregations are the bully, adamantly telling another person that their sense of basic dignity and worth is less than other humans because of the body they were born into. My guess is that the majority of religious folks and congregations fall somewhere in the middle. More like me that day. Privately supportive, well-intentioned, good people, nobody thinks they're not, but who, when the stakes are high and there's something to be won or lost, kind of sit back and wait to see how things will play out. And it's so shocking to me that that's the place that Western religion has found itself in, given that the stories and the scriptures that make up the Judeo-Christian tradition, our ancestors, we're certainly more than that now, but that's where we came out of. The stories that make up the scriptures of that tradition are full of people struggling with whether or not they belong. I can't think of a major biblical story that's not about that theme. Stories written by human beings who were obviously struggling with the same questions. Look at the first humans the Bible presents us with. They can't stand just being who they were, and so they sought to be something different against the better advice of the Creator. And then they get cast out of the place that they called home. Their children fight with one another. The story of Moses leading the Hebrew people is one of slaves being told they are not in fact slaves of the chosen people of God. Stories of a woman, Ruth, moving to a new land and adopting her family's new people as her people. It's stories of Jacob and Esau fighting over whether or not they get to be the most beloved child. The story of Jonah is one of him getting so frustrated and mad with God that God doesn't punish his enemies for him. But at the center of all of those stories for me is somebody wondering, do I belong in the body I'm wearing? Do I belong in the garden? Do I belong in this family? Do I belong in this tribe? Do I belong in this country? But at the center of almost all of these stories is a fundamental question. Am I worthy of the love of something holy? Am I worthy of the love of another human being, of a people, of a family, if I stay exactly the way I am? And it's almost impossible for me to understand the Christian tradition through any other lens than marginalized people becoming agents in the work of the holy on earth. For me, that's the most miraculous thing that the teacher Jesus does. And how the story of that human gets turned around toward excluding others and telling them that they are less than human is beyond my imagination. How does that happen? How does the story of a brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jew born to an unwed teenage mom who crosses borders without papers before he's born, who then gives birth to him and he becomes a homeless, illiterate rabbi, surrounded by friends who are also illiterate blue-collar workers, promises to heal and feed all, and dies unjustly at the hands of the state? That's not my story. I didn't write that. How does that story of that person get turned around to be a tool for exclusion and dehumanization? How does that happen? And how have progressives given up on that guy as a model to talk about? I think we've too easily, because of the connotations and the frustrations and the worries that people like Gail are going to worry about us when we have the word church outside, cast out one of the best models for what it means to talk about bringing marginalized people into the center. I don't believe in the kind of miracles that turn water into wine or raise people from the dead. But I think the greatest miracle that the teacher Jesus ever made happen in the world was to convince dirt poor, illiterate people living in occupied territory who were some actually untouchable, that not only did they deserve the love of other humans, not only did they deserve the love of God, their parent, not only were they worthy at their core, they would be agents of the kingdom of God on earth. That's a big deal. One of my favorite stories about him doesn't come from the Bible. It's a retelling from a Unitarian woman named Sophia Foz. She retells the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 in a book of hers called Jesus the Carpenter's Son. And instead of taking not enough food and miraculously making it a lot, her story is more of like a biblical stone soup. He kind of just says, so I know you're hungry. Does anybody have anything in their coat hiding away they haven't really talked about yet? And somebody pulls out a piece of fish. Somebody goes, okay, all right, I've got some olives. And all of a sudden there's a feast. Miracle to me is that starving, hungry people not only become the people to receive a gift, but they become the host. They move from bystander to participant, from guest to host, and that's the movement of those stories to me. And our Universalist heritage here today in this church, as a Unitarian Universalist church, certainly rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but more than that, our Universalist ancestors said that we had to take that notion of belonging and expand it to cosmic proportions. Not only would every human being be reunited with the holy in death, they said, but there was no hell, is no hell, wouldn't be no hell. And that there might not have been a reason for all of this religious posturing in the first place. They posited not only that you didn't have to get right with the holy, but that you were never not right with the holy. Not just that every religion belonged, not just that every person belonged, but that every atom in creation belonged. Nothing was out of place. And so for me, today, our task as a church, any church, but our church, is to build a community that to the best that we can, that's an important qualifier, to the best that we can, when we gather, reflects a reality in which every atom in creation belongs. Last week, Reverend Cantor talked about that for us being a very this-worldly faith. We don't tend to make big claims about what happened before or after, but we do know what's happening right now. I think when we talk about a genuinely inclusive faith, there are some misconceptions people sometimes can have about that. One of them that I hear often is that we can be all things to all people. That if your sister-in-law comes and she didn't like it, somehow we did something wrong. Have you ever been to one of those restaurants that serves every kind of world cuisine? You know how bad it is? There's a version of religion that could look like that could try very desperately in a well-intentioned inclusion to make sure that you were going to hear a Buddhist story one week and a Muslim story the next and a story from science the next week, that you couldn't walk away without hearing every single religion referenced in the span of an hour. And to me, that would kind of end up like the world buffet. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to like it here, that everyone's going to like the style of music or the preachers or the way that we structure things. But at our best, it should mean that your atheist sister-in-law and your fundamentalist Christian aunt may not like what they hear when they're here, but they'll walk away knowing that we believe that at a basic level they are worthy of all the love we can muster, even if we disagree vehemently. For me, when we talk about a genuinely inclusive faith, it does mean work for LGBT justice and inclusion. It does mean racial equity and justice work. It does mean working for women's rights and fighting poverty in our cities. But those aren't merely political aims. They're religious aims. They are meant to reflect the reality of the universe itself, in which nothing was created separate from the force that created it. It's meant to reflect a reality in which every person, every atom, every molecule of creation does belong. But that's not somewhere you can go. You can't go to an inclusive church. You have to make an inclusive church when you get there. Because when you leave today, it doesn't exist. The building isn't an inclusive church. The bylaws aren't an inclusive church. An inclusive church community is as effective as you are to the person sitting next to you in the pews today. That was a fundamental mistake I made as a teenager, thinking that the work of inclusion that I privately held to be good was going to happen whether I did something or not. Inclusive community doesn't exist unless you move, from the position of guest to host, consumer to builder, tourist to citizen. I love that my child is going to grow up, my children are going to grow up in a community where they see two women that I love so much become engaged in the middle of a worship service in our church. I love that he's going to grow up knowing that when this Sunday rolls around, he's getting himself ready to march in the Pride Parade with his brother. But what I love most about that is that he will not grow up believing that he can inherit the world he wants to live in without doing anything. I'm not asking him to go watch the Pride Parade. I'm inviting him to go march in it. What a dramatic act those first ones must have been. People who were sick and tired of being scared and beaten and treated like they were less than human, who finally decided they would fight back. What a dramatic moment for a group of people who said, if you will not throw us a parade, we will throw one for ourselves. Thank you very much. And what a wonderful thing for the beloved community to be big enough for people like me to be invited to join them. Our biggest goal here in saying that we're building a genuinely inclusive faith basically means that we're going to build a world as best we can, and we're going to screw up, but as best we can, that reflects that every atom of creation belongs, and that work comes out of who we are, not despite it. So I hope that your relationship here, I hope that what happens for you when you come to this place is not that you get to go to an inclusive community. The goal isn't that we create an inclusive church. The goal is that we create people who build the beloved community in the radius around them wherever they go. That the next room you're in, you are not the guest, you're the host. That the city you live in is not a tourist attraction, but your opportunity to be a citizen and build a just and loving world. That the church you go to is your responsibility. So I hope for you that this place, as best we can, reflects a reality in which all things belong. And I hope that you hear and believe loud and clear that you get to play a role in holding that up wherever you go. May it be so. Amen.